you need to have a place to start. You need to have a point of view. You need to get the machine to ask you the right sort of questions. But if you can get that going, then I think that you can set up a pretty good workflow, which helps to at least excavate your thoughts from tangential points of view. I didn't get into the actual corporate life. I was in my final year in the internship. I got told that I was not a good fit for the role. Then I went and started off my entrepreneurial sort of like ventures. And this is approximately now 23 years ago. The clock speed of the world is just increased. And there's just so much more flux in the world, which is why I think there's a heavy rotation towards generalist more than specialist these days, whereby, you can quickly learn and you can quickly unlearn the things. Error correction loop, if you can speed it up, that's also like one of the cheat codes in life.
I'm very curious about, and I think a lot of people would, is your thinking around your writing and some of your methodology around that. So that's really one of the main questions that I had today. But I thought it would be also interesting. This is where I might, go off the rails too, is that I thought you had a pretty interesting backstory from what I read. Was just that it's almost like the aspirational entrepreneur story in a way, where you started on corporate. You thought for whatever reason, maybe this is not for me. This is not purposeful. You did the entrepreneurial thing, exits, and now you're in venture capital and the managing director of High Output Ventures. And so I don't know. I'd love to understand just a little bit about that journey so that we have context.
Yeah, for sure. I think the quick backstory is that when I got into university, the idea was to go into investment banking, got into that whole cycle. I didn't get into the actual corporate life. I was in my final year in the internship. I got told that I was not a good fit for the role. And then I went and started off my entrepreneurial sort of like ventures. And this is 2003, so approximately now 23 years ago. And so in that span of 23 years, I think as most entrepreneurs in the earlier part of their cycle, you were just discovering what is it that you're good at, where can you build an edge? And the cycles back then were also a lot slower. I felt like the feedback loops to distribute, get customers, get clients, get all of this working was much harder in the earlier days. And if I remember when I was running an advertising agency, going pitching agencies, running through those long sort of RFP cycles, which still exists in enterprise accounts today. But it just felt for even SME contracts and everything, we just had to, it took forever to build a business. Now, when I coach younger sort of entrepreneurs and I see what they can do with the single person teams and leveraging all the tools that they have, it's amazing. And so I went through this process of building these businesses, started with services businesses where it was HR consulting and then advertising, and then got into technology businesses in 2010, and then basically did that for the next 7 years. And I think the common thread like throughout the whole thing was stacking different skills along the way. How do you hire? How do you recruit? How do you sell? And I think all of these exposed me to a whole array of problems. And I think cross-domain expertise today comes at a premium, because if someone has got this varied set, which was usually looked down upon because usually it was specialized, become really good at something, and then become world-class at it. But I think Dharmesha had a really good podcast about this, and he said, think about becoming the best of in 3 or more concentric circles, like best at, let's say, writing, accounting, vibe coding, or something like that. And the intersection of that is somewhere where you can do it. I think I didn't have that reasoning when I was doing it, but I was picking up each one of these skills. Like I spent a considerably large amount of time designing interfaces between 2010 and 2014. And so people still today come up to me and say, can I get your mid-journey prompts, or how did you do this on the website, or what's happening? But I spent a considerable amount of time just doing the design work as well. And I think that's the stacking. And I feel like you can do all of what I did and took a much longer period of time to get it done in a much shorter period of time today. And I think that's the opportunity. because I think I've written about this. The clock speed of the world is just increased, and there's just so much more flux in the world, which is why I think there's a heavy rotation towards generalist more than specialist these days, whereby you can quickly learn and you can quickly unlearn the things which you used to know in the past, and that unlearning is actually an extremely difficult thing to do, especially if you were good at it and you were paid a lot of money to do it, because you really don't have that much incentive to unlearn. And I think that's the opportunity between legacy co and new cos, because structurally they're stuck in incentive structures which don't incentivize them to unlearn.
Well said. But really interesting. So that brings you today then to, I don't, if you want to, just share a bit on how High Output Ventures, like your
So
vision mission.
High Output Ventures, I set up in 2017. Primarily, it was a venture fund which was doing SaaS e-commerce investments in the South Asia region from that period of time. I think in 2021, post-COVID, 22 valuations in the segment got really inflated. That's when I rotated into more professional services, service type businesses to try to see whether we could buy them. The initial idea was not to use AI. It was basically to use my expertise in offshoring and finding talent from remote talents and sort of buying firms and being more efficient with them. That's how I stumbled into the world of accounting roll-ups. And that led me to just writing more about professional services as the industry as a whole. And today, High Output Venture partners with domain experts or works with potential founders who are working on newcos to help them to structure their businesses, invest in them, and scale them up. So that's primarily where I'm spending most of my work. It's how do you sort of like take the judgment that you have built over a period of a career or a life cycle and then encode that into these tools and scale your professional services practice without scaling headcount.
I want to share this one quote that I just thought was really sharp of yours. I invest in and advise newcos, companies trying to escape the gravity of labor economics. You explain it?
Yeah, I think like the newco legacy co framing, essentially my whole thesis is that professional services firms scale through labor or human leverage in the past. That's basically how revenue scaled. And newcos is a rotation of that labor economic leverage to technology leverage. A lot of people believe then that's like what startups do or SaaS companies do or things like that because they use technology. But a lot of the time, professional services was protected from a lot of this technology disruption because a lot of the work felt bespoke, a lot of the data was unstructured. There was a need for human in the loop in a lot of these factors for these things to get done. And I believe today's technology is getting up to the point where it's definitely not the place where it's going to replace partner level judgment, but it's getting to the point where a lot of those things, unstructured data, encoding judgment into these things, decision traces, context graphs, all of these things which are forming now around us, provide the scaffolding for professional services firms now to use that technology rotation. And that's what I do. So instead of figuring out how to just scale your labor side of the business, how do you actually build the foundations for a newco to scale with technology? And encoding judgment into resolution libraries that I've written about quite a bit is actually a very difficult process. And that's where I'm spending most of my time right now, because that's why we've picked also verticals like cost, benefit administration, insurance claims, R&D tax credits, all of these industries where there is a certain amount of judgment required, but there's a lot of deterministic work that happens behind the scenes that humans usually do through patterns. And that's what we're encoding right now with a bunch of clients. And it's been a lot of fun because some of the stuff is actually working now.
Interesting. Is it Are you bringing resources like capital, but in addition to that, it's how this new infrastructure technology works, or are you targeting
Yeah.
companies that are already heading down the right technology road?
Yeah, there's sometimes when it's very early in the cycle, it's capital plus technology. So we put capital into the business if that needs to be, and then also uh, connect them with technology partners or internal sort of like technology expertise that we have at HOV to put those teams together and to scaffold the first MVPs to see whether we can actually build a control plane for these companies. How is the data coming in? How is it structured? Where are these decisions happening? How do you sort of like build these resolution libraries? And tomorrow's post talks about like this thing called context graphs, which everyone is talking about. Essentially, the missing piece for a lot of technology right now is that in any CRM or database, you have a person, you have a deal won, deal lost, maybe you'll have a little description about it. But what decisions were taken to enable that person to close that deal is just, spread all over the place. And if you can actually figure out how to reconstruct how decisions were made within a firm and build a layer on top of that, which I call resolution libraries, that's where we're seeing the most impact in some of these decisions, especially let's say for insurance claim. There was a company that raised a large amount of money yesterday in the same area where claims administration is one of those things which I think is going to get disrupted quite a bit over here, where humans were in the loop for a lot of these things. And now they're just essentially letting machines handle a lot of this context. And I think this just slowly moves out from deterministic to gray zone areas that I've written about very quickly.
You mentioned, just to go back to the old codes, I
Yeah.
guess, had this one great quote here: everyone's debating AI strategy in professional services, but your incentive model determines whether an AI creates leverage or just optimizes decline. You touched on that already a little bit, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the incentive structure is uh, the biggest. Like, let's say that you're a partner or you're a senior leader who's accumulated a decade plus of experience through pattern matching and exposure to get to the level where you can make these decisions, where people pay you a lot of money to help you decide. Essentially, if a lot of that judgment gets collapsed into a resolution library where the machine starts making decisions similar to what you would make, that makes people uncomfortable at best, because they're like, if the machine can do it versus what I'm doing it, essentially there's very little incentive for you to build these resolution libraries, because you will continue to defend that the work is too bespoke. You can't sort of like, every situation is different. And so the incentive to change is hard from an individual level. And then from a firm level, I've written about this, that firms do engagement level sort of like pricing. The whole way of a professional service firm is that you engage someone, they say, this is the work that I need to get done. They coach you, here's how many people, here's how long it's going to take, you get it done. There's a whole process around it. And I think new codes will sort of like disrupt this to go resolution based. What is the specific outcome that you're trying to get to? And let us try to sort of like get to that outcome and get compensated based on that. So if your entire business is built on engagement level economics, moving to resolution level economics is not viable, because the pyramid doesn't allow for that. And I think this was one, in the early days, this was the biggest sort of pushback I got from people about bottom of the pyramid. How is this going to work? Now I think the McKinsey boss has come out to say, like, we've got to change the structure of our business. There are going to be a lot more agents in our business than before. I think the narrative has dramatically changed in 26 compared to early 25. But I still think that they have an incentive problem, because switching to outcome-based pricing, where your outcomes are gray or not very visible, or the feedback loops are too long, is going to be extremely difficult for them to rotate.
Curious, what do you think it looks like in 5, 10 years? What happens to the big four, the big
I
consulting
still
giants?
think like one of the things I didn't understand about like the big four, these large companies, is that uh, this liability transfer that happens when you hire a big four firm to do a project for you, and let's say that it either messes up or it doesn't deliver, you can transfer some of that blame over to that firm, and that's a shield. I still think liability transfer as a service is a very valuable thing. Now, the only deal happens is that it comes back to incentives. So certain larger firms will continue to do that because they'll need the cover. But I think like lots of incumbent firms will start up from the bottom. I think there's this quote which says no melts from the edges. And I definitely think like the big firms are very large. They have these incumbent businesses where potentially in that period of time, they could see a contraction of their business, the size of their business, because I'm sure they will lose money from the edges. Uh, so I still think that they're definitely going to be around. I don't think they disappear, but I think like where these deterministic cycles with light judgment areas are the ones that at least we're focusing on right now, which these firms are wanting to also disposed of because they're not high margin for them. They take up too many things. Like some of them are not very profitable. So they're letting go of these practices. And I think like that's where new opportunities live today, where the cost structure of a big company cannot support the new sort of like pricing structure in the market. And because of that mismatch, you have to let go of the business. And I think there was this example from Bethlehem Steel where very similar disruption happened. Like, they let go of the smaller edges in the steel, the corners and everything in the beginning. And then Nucor sort of like came up and took those pieces and ultimately sort of like disrupted the bigger guys. I think the story has been told in the past before as to how it plays out. But I think the difference over here is that the human to human connection, the partner connection, the liability transfer sort of like makes this a lot more stickier to go. Because when I've been talking to legacy codes, I've also had more appreciation for what they're stuck in, because a lot of their clients don't want to switch the model out either. They want the reliability of knowing how much it's going to cost them, what is it going to be. Outcome-based pricing with caps are complicated to do. No one has the budget or the authority to let those go. It makes deals complicated. And so I've spoken to a lot of like client side, and they also don't want to change. And so I think like you're stuck in this loop whereby both sides need large pushes to do so. And this is why we do what we do at HOV, because I think like while you're trying to figure out this loop, there's so many opportunities that are being created below.
When you say, because you've mentioned this a couple of times, people don't want to change.
Right.
You mentioned unlearning.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember the post title or the newsletter title, The Masks We Can't Remove.
Right.
Are these all connected? Are these all the same problem? Is this all the same problem?
Yeah, I think I alluded to this earlier. Is just when you are very good at something, or there's a certain credibility attached to what you want to do, and to change that, like, and it's not like partner compensation is only going up. I think one of the more viral posts last year were like, this trend that I was saying, like, why is partner comp increasing whereas they're decreasing the hiring at the bottom end, but partner comp is going up? Like, this doesn't sound right. And so this lock-in sort of remains over there. And it's very difficult to let go of personas or identities we've had. I've written about this multiple times for myself, letting go of like a founder persona to take on an investor persona, or an investor persona to do a writer persona. Like who are you in the middle of these messy transition periods? Because then people are like, what do you do? And then that ambiguity is both painful for yourself as well as other people, because you can't connect anymore, because then which tribe do you belong to? And I think many people are in that messy middle right now, where everyone sees Claude Code right now, and I'm getting messages, should I be doing this? Should I be building stuff on this? Or should, you know, but I think getting the larger narrative in play is very difficult. And sometimes it's emergent rather than just pushing down labels from the top.
So this is it's a good segue in a way to the topic I'm really interested in, which is digging a little bit into your thinking about writing. And so we touched on a few of these things already at the start, but you have really, I mean, you have pretty in-depth knowledge around an industry that you're an outsider for. And I see the synergies that you've learned from others. But then on the other hand, you're pretty knowledgeable about in-depth aspects of the industry. And so you talk about, as far as I've understood, you set up conversations. You have conversations, calls with new co's, old co's. Yeah, what's your strategy there? How does that, is that how you get such, in-depth writing? And how do you see your writing? Like, is it a are you having these conversations? It's almost like a journal in a way of the conversations that you're having.
Yeah. I think early on, um, when I look back at my writing, just when I was trying to make sense of it myself, there were definitely gaps in my thinking. And then the DMs kept on coming from people from within the industry who were seeing things and wanted to chat. And then last year, I think at the height of it, I was probably talking between 5 to 10 folks every single week that would just reach out on LinkedIn and say, like, hey, could we talk about what you wrote over here, or here's what I'm seeing? And frankly, many of the posts are synthesis, high level synthesis of some of these conversations that I've had with people, where they've said something which made it click for me. And then I sort of like took that and synthesized it and wrote about it so that it makes sense for me. Because I think like the new core, legacy core framing came later in the year, when I just got like people were talking about what's the alternative to this, and like there was like, is it a startup? Is it boutique consulting firms that come up, and do we just use technology for it? And I think like that just forced me into framing this, because I think there was also a question: how do you fund new cores? Because a lot of new cores that spin out like need capital, but don't need so much capital to get started as compared to others, because they usually get work from their old clients or things like that. So revenue starts to flow in relatively quickly. And so my framing was heavily influenced then by all of these conversations that I had in the past year. And I think that just made the writing better. And the comment section of my post became something where I was spending a lot of time, because people had very detailed discussions in those comment posts. And I'm now trying to figure out how can I mine all my comment posts from the past, because they have a lot of really good stuff in them, which is then what's led me to creating the community now, where a lot of the discussions, at least this year, will be in the community that we're setting up.
So we might as well, although I'll jump back again because I got some more questions about your writing. But tell me then about this new community, because even I saw your announcement, but I haven't dug in too far.
Yeah, I think there was a tipping point where there were enough people reaching out which were working on new cores, which had left, which were exploring new cores, and like all these conversations either happened over email, on LinkedIn DMs, or things like that. And we decided to create a closed invite only community that we can sort of like move people into. And that's basically when I launched the Frame Break community. It's like invite only community initially, which I plan to keep pretty select for the first 3 to 6 months at least, where you're either working on a new code, or you're part of it, or you're heavily sort of like thinking about it. And for us to swap stories, to figure out as to what is working, what's not working, what are they seeing, and just having higher resolution sort of like conversations around this. And that's the core of what I'm building now with the framework community. There'll be an app that gets pushed out at the end of this month. So a lot of my writing will also be on the app, and then the app just has the community features built into it, where if you're part of the community, then you'll sort of like also be able to just chat and be part of those events.
Is the audience primarily new small company founders, aspiring founders, or you're also getting individuals from old co's who are interested in what's going on?
I think most of them are people who have perhaps left legacy codes or in the process of leaving legacy codes to sort of get that done. So, but there are some people at, let's say, private equity firms, which have already sort of like rolled up a considerable amount of professional service firms. And there's this very large gap, which is a talent gap first. Like, okay, now we've bought all of this. What sort of talent do we need to do this rotation? How do we get this done? What is the technology that we need? Like, how do we structure this? There are lots of details that need to be discussed over there. And then there are lots of people who are building software for this space as well. Which is really interesting because the data problems that we're dealing with, how do you structure the data? How do you set up these resolution libraries? How do you build control planes? Like there's also a very deep technical sort of like part of this. And I'm just building people from all sorts who are doing all of this so that they can speak to one another and we can all just learn at a faster rate, because I think as model capacity becomes better, the opportunity window will naturally shrink. And so that's what we're trying to do right now.
I think just in general, there's already been this trend around communities, and but you see that growing and growing. I'm a member of a couple of things in my niche, and they're just such high value, and it's powerful just to bring together like-minded individuals. So you've got on the one extreme these social platforms that are so much noise, so busy every day, and some of them manage that better than others, but it's getting to be very overwhelming. And then there's the emergence of community, thoughtful, and I see communities just being a really valuable asset for that. So that's very interesting that you're building it.
I see the LinkedIn social part of like lurkers, people who discover you, top of the funnel, newsletters you become a little more engaged, and then community is where you actually want to go much deeper. And I think I was just surprised as to how many people are interested at that layer, because I think that will continue to grow. But I see that as the thing. So I see each of them having, I wouldn't have discovered half the people or more than half the people if I hadn't started writing on LinkedIn. There has to be some sort of like, if I stayed too long at that fidelity layer, it's too noisy. The algorithm is also over there. Lots of people who said, I missed this post, or when did you post this? I didn't get it. So the newsletter helps with that. But my newsletter frequency was also a bit hectic for people to get an email from me every single day. So that's become a little more manageable. But I think the community then at a much smaller group is the right sort of like resolution for the group who wants to go deeper.
I would love to get these. So now that we're talking on writing, just a couple really specific insights from you. Think about you're speaking to aspiring writers, people who want to build their public voice.
Right.
I'm curious a few things, and I'll let you riff a bit here, but you did 277 posts last year, if that's correct.
Yeah.
You alluded at the beginning that that's a heavy lift, and from a writer, I can tell you, I can imagine how much time you spend on that. So I'm curious about how much time were you dedicating to writing?
Yeah.
How do you think about writing? I'm curious if some of your marketing expertise from the past translates over to this, because the one thing that I would say, aside from being a very well articulate writer, you're great at naming things. This is something I encourage clients and just in general, new codes, legacy codes, the way that you frame different things happening in the industry is very powerful when you give something a name. So it's the naming. So I'm just curious about how much time you put into it, And how do you think about writing? How do you approach it?
Yeah, I think writing is a form of clarifying your thinking, the way that you uh, like when I think about a idea or a concept, and I'm talking with the founder about it, and we could verbalize it. I could riff on something with you, but when you are forced to write it down and then synthesize it, simplify it, that entire process helps dramatically. Also, my background is relatively varied. Over the last 20 years, I spent time advertising agencies, HR products, crypto, venture capital fund, PE fund, and I think the common thread across all of those is that businesses, regardless, have like the same similar types of problems, whether that be value creation, value capture, incentive structures, people problems. And when you come from it from the outside, as I did with professional services, you tend to see things that you saw in other sort of like industries and map them over here. And I think that's also gave me a an edge as to how I was seeing this. And then the the labels that I put in the writing helped to label things that people were already experiencing inside, but perhaps had not labeled it such. And then it just comes to life then. So from the time perspective, I think last year from the start to September, it was between 4 to 5 hours a day. That's how long it would take to get one of those posts out. Like there could have been an outline for the post, which I may have sort of like written and then refined everything from that to the title, to the subtitle, to the image. That's how long it took. And that's basically why by September, I was like 4 to 5 hours a day. If you even work a normal 8-hour day, is 50% of your time or more spent over there. And I was spending the morning doing this, which is perhaps like the best time to do thinking and writing, but then it's also the best time to do other work, which is high value work as well. So it was taking a long time, which is why I reduced the number of postings. So it was taking a long time. I think with the way that I was doing, because I was writing every day, for people who were subscribed to the newsletter, when you unsubscribed or said you could remain subscribed to certain days. So I'd broken up every single day into a thematic sort of like post. So I knew what I was going to directionally be writing on. Like Mondays were always posts where I was going to write about my framework. Tuesday were public company review days, and and so on. So I think like breaking down, like you can call them pillars, you can call them whatever you want, is helpful in bucketing what it is that you need to focus on. And then basically when I narrowed it down, Nuco was the only sort of like pillar that survived. And that's what I focused on now. So there was pillars, and then there was a lot of research that is required to go into each one of those posts now. Like, if you're going to write on the changing, like a Tuesday post on public companies, well, there are lots of public companies, and then how do you evaluate them? What's the angle around it? How does it fit into the larger narrative of things? That also took a considerable amount of time for you to get done. And so you have all of this input that you do through research that comes in. I had built a thing which I use called Frame-Break Intelligence, which I might open source or release later this year, which had basically taken all my feeds, all the podcasts, and it sort of like ingested all of them and provided me a daily look at what was happening in all the feeds that I was looking at. And that helped me find articles, positions that I wanted to do. And then I would double click into one of those, expand on that in my own point of view, write about it, and then publish, and then do that every single day. That was the hard part. When I started writing about consulting, so if someone goes back and reads my work from January 2025 compared to what I'm writing now, there's going to be a very large delta between what I was saying at the start of the year and the end of the year. And that's why I treated the writing as more so a public journal, where I was like, this is what I'm seeing. Is this how it works? And then people who were in the field would correct me, would message me privately, would tell me, you're right about this, wrong about this. And I think that error correction loop, if you can speed it up, that's also like one of the cheat codes in life. The faster that feedback loop becomes, the faster you can sort of move. And I benefited greatly from that last year when the velocity was as high as it was. And that's something that I would definitely recommend also, especially when you're early on in the cycle. Yeah, that's at a high level, that's basically the mechanics of how I work. There was a research pipeline that came in, expanded on it. It was broken down into pillars. Took 4 to 5 hours to complete a piece and schedule, and then there was another at least 90 minutes of back and forth in LinkedIn comments that I had to spend doing as well, because and so there you have it. It was basically like a pretty much full-time job to write a more detailed piece every single day.
I mean, the work reflects it, so that's good. But you must have seen then ROI from someone like yourself putting 4 or 5 hours a day. You
Right.
mentioned, the conversations that you're having every week. What has it done for your business, you personally?
Yeah, I think like the doors and the people that it opened to, like regardless of which city I was going to, finding someone at one of these larger firms to talk to them and to connect with a lot of people in the private equity space. A lot of the deals that we're doing now are all downstream from connections that were random DMs, and they were like, hey, I like the thinking around this. This is what we're working on. We'd like you to come and talk to the leadership team, or we would like to sort of like get you over there, even though I don't do consulting work per se. But earlier last year, I was taking all of these calls. I would happily sit with a leadership team at a legacy co so that they could ask me all the difficult questions, and then each one of those conversations turned out to be fodder for my own writing,
That's
because
right.
I would know where they would pick on in the weak parts of the logic structure that I have. And they still remain lots of areas, but I think it was just a very good recursive loop. And so I wouldn't trade it like with anything. Like I would still go back and do that if I was starting this year. There's something that I was really passionate about and wanted to get into, that I would replay that immediately.
How do you use AI with either the writing aspect or the thinking aspect or the research aspect? Or, I mean, do you use it?
Yeah. So AI is a lot of the part. So one of the tricks that I like, not tricks, a workflow that I like is, let's say that we pick a topic which is um, whatever. It could be like a viral post was Accenture sort of like results and what it means for the next year and how it looks at it. So I would tell it so I was using Claude. Claude is my tool of choice over here. There was a project set up which was called my LinkedIn writing. So basically, all the writing was sort of like given to Claude. So there was a file which has all of my posts, and it has all the granular details of the post as well, which is like how did it perform, blah blah blah, impressions, everything. And anyway, so it would have all of my writing, and then I would say that interview me for this directional piece that I'm here, and ask me questions about, here's the outline, ask me questions. And I think then I use this tool called Monologue to just talk like this. So you ask me a question, I go and answer back. And so I don't type, and I just sort of like respond as a person. And that helps to synthesize a lot of my thoughts. And then you use that to come up with an outline, then clean it up, and then I think that one piece with the question and answer back loop is perhaps the biggest lift that someone who hasn't been writing can do to quickly at least get something onto the page. And so that helped. It helps with all the editing and all the aspects of their mid-journey for the images and things like that. And so that was basically my workflow. you need to have a place to start. You need to have a point of view. You need to get the machine to ask you the right sort of questions. But if you can get that going, then I think that you can set up a pretty good workflow, which helps to at least excavate your thoughts from tangential points of view.
I'm going to have to check out Monologue. I treat my LLMs like that as well. I think that was a huge unlock that maybe not a lot of people know about, is to get them to interview you and ask you questions to get to a better result. That changed my way of using it. And also audio. I go for walks. Even when I'm driving, I put the the Bluetooth on and I have conversations all the time. And it helps me. It's like a team member. It's like a strategist, having somebody at your level trained on given a role, trained on a certain data set. For you, it's your writing, and then having conversations. I mean, it helps me think deeper. So I find it a huge unlock. That's clearly one action out of the 277 posts. Just for like one of my final questions here, do you have any other 2-3 big takeaways that you've learned for somebody who's maybe aspiring to become more public and a little bit more intentional about what they're sharing?
Yeah, I think like you don't need permission. You need a point of view to get started, and I think like it has to be relatively contrarian over there, because I think like there's so much content these days that if you just sort of like just write a a very safe piece about like what AI is going to do to professional services or automate it, like I don't think that you're going to sort of like stand out. One of the things that I eventually gravitated to is the framework, because then that becomes my original thinking as to how all these pieces fit together to get it going. So you can't arrive at a framework directly, but you can sort of like take a position, create sort of like content, see where it has holes in it, and continue to iterate on that. And if you can do that, I think that's when you actually build a position that hopefully you fully believe in. And then, like you said, you can label things in that. You can actually build something where people can actually talk to you from that. And there was this piece that I referenced in my latest newsletter called Context Graphs, and it's gone super mega viral on X right now. And she just labeled something really high level as to what is needed for organizations to level up with the agent use, and that was it. Like a lot of people had written similar articles that I had read, and she had just named it very well, talked about the process, about their own thesis around it. And I think that's original sort of like thinking, which benefits then from that cross-domain expertise that I mentioned earlier on. So you have to see it from multiple vantage points to be able to see those contrarian sort of like gaps in the market.
We agreed. Anything we didn't cover, Usman, about the community, about what you're up to next?
Well, this was fun. First podcast of the year for me. So this year is going to be all about hopefully getting more of this playbook out. The goal is to write the playbook and to document it mostly in public so that everyone can actually see it. And again, and then for me to implement it this year and then to cycle back the learnings so that people can actually learn as to how some of this stuff is working, where the gaps are, where to focus on. And I also might start writing a little bit more this year as well on Framebreak. So that's also something that I'm looking forward to as well.
Awesome. Well, we're looking forward to your writing as always. I'm very interested in the playbook. The playbook, if you were going to give it one sentence, is this the operating manual for the new co? How do you put it?
Yeah, I think it's the operating manual for the new co. Well, when we started talking about the playbook last year, I thought, how do we sort of like position them from GDM marketing aspect and come from that. But when I started working at the firms, uh, we actually need to fix a lot of the internal plumbing first before we went from the outside. So instead of going outside in, now I'm inside out, trying to figure out like, okay, how do you actually reshuffle the entire system? And my friend has written a really good book about this called Reshuffle, Sangeet Chaudhary, and I would highly recommend it. But I think this whole idea of bolting AI onto existing human processes and say this is going to speed it up is not NUCO. I think those are efficiency gains which are going to get commoditized very quickly. I think the area that I'm concentrating on is like cost structure. How is the company set up? Like, because ultimately the companies with the most efficient cost structure are the ones that are going to win in the future. And so that's where I'm spending most of my time. And yeah, I'm actually working with the firms this year, so it's going to be cool to share with everyone as to what I'm seeing then.
Exciting. Well, it'll be very interesting to follow you along and see where things head this year. And thanks for taking the time to chat, because I really admire your writing. I admire how you tackle problems. I think it's really interesting, and I'm looking forward to continue to follow your work.
Right. Same here. All the very best with the community. I think also just helping people getting more of this out, because I think attention is like, there was a quote that I liked, which was attention is the last moat or something like that. And I think like it ties in very well with what we've been saying. Like you've got to have a point of view to get attention, then you've got to articulate it correctly, and then you've got to get it out there. It's hard work, but if that's where moats are, then generally it takes a lot of work to get that done. I personally have benefited for when you build them out, so I would recommend it. It's always hard getting started, but you got to start from somewhere.
Well said. Well said. Thanks for chatting, Usman.
All right. Same here.